I have to apologize to my other panelists that I arrived late to my own party. First, first of all, I was actually talking to a client, and it's very interesting. Actually, they were saying that they really want to have a larger budget to promote their brand because they think it would be very helpful to the business. But the CEO is actually previously their CFO and is generally skeptical about investment in such things. And so they're trying very hard to try and convince the guy. And it's very interesting that if I go back 25 years when I set up brand finance, that was really why I set brand finance up, to help people frame the arguments as to why they should make certain decisions around brands and marketing, and in particular, why they should be given budgets to do what they want to, and then use them in the most efficient way. And so when it came around to our 25th anniversary this year, I was trying to think of, how would we celebrate the 25th anniversary? I apologize to everyone who's listening that we have so far not actually been able to do a physical event, but the online ones have been quite enjoyable and have stimulated a lot of activity. So I was trying to think, well, what things could we do? So we've actually created 3 one-hour seminars. What we found is webinars are always better if they're not more than an hour. When we do them physically, we do them for half a day or a day, and there are lots of breaks, and you can actually meet and chat. So I hope they will shortly be back. So this is a 1-hour session. I wanted to talk about the things that were being talked about 25 years ago and where we are with them. And the first one that we're talking about today is the debate about global versus local. Back then, when I set up brand finance, there was a lot of talk about, Levitt was always going on about how individual local brands were of not much significance, and it was very hard to get much out of them. Everyone should be going for global brands. And many clients actually followed that, and I think sometimes made mistakes. Unilever had a policy of going for global brands rather than local brands, and I think 1 or 2 unfortunate divestment decisions were made as a result of that policy. So things have become more subtle, and today I hope we're going to have quite an interesting debate about that. There are lots of different aspects to it, so I'm extremely pleased that our partners, Tata Consultancy Services, World Trademark Review, Foreign Press Association, Museum of Brands, have all been able to support us in doing this. It's great to have their support. And the other speakers, I think we'll have a very interesting, lively debate. Dagmara Schulze, who is head of the IAA, we've been working with for about 6 to 9 months now, or is it a year, Dagmara? And we've done some great reports and some great events, and they're always fun. So I'm looking forward to what you have to say. Rahul Malhotra, who runs the Shell brand from Singapore now, but previously from Switzerland, has a very interesting perspective, obviously, from a brand like Shell, which has been big and global for 100 years and is grappling with all the issues that we're talking about. And then Mehul Kapadia from Vodafone, which we were just chatting about earlier on this week when we were pre-briefing for this session, that Vodafone started as a mishmash of lots of small brands, but became a global brand. So it's been through the whole process. So it'll be very interesting to hear what the perspectives are. Now, with that, I will shut up. And I think we start with you, don't we, Dagmara? So over to you. I look forward to that and to having a debate about it all in about 30 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. And hello, everyone. My name is Dagmara Schulze. I'm the Global Managing Director of the International Advertising Association. So before I dive into the topic of the living brand ecosystems, which we believe right now is the concept on how to build high-value brands, let me just quickly introduce you to IEA. So IEA was established 83 years ago in New York with a vision to be the first global association that harbors knowledge from all the different sectors of the industry, plus the academia, to share with the industry basically what does it take to build high-value brands. If you can switch to the next slide, please. We are present across 56 countries. So the combination of the kind of global outreach plus all the different sectors allows us truly to tap into the best of the industry expertise to come up with concepts and points of view on what does it take to build high-value brands, where the industry is going, and share it with the industry across a portfolio of our events. Next slide. our purpose in the industry is to serve as the global compass. So on one hand, we point the industry to kind of the next frontier of the knowledge, and while helping the industry to navigate through the current challenges to do obviously with the pandemic, with changing consumer behaviors, with changing technology. We have a series of events as well as education programs to constantly re-educate the industry on the transformation of the industry and the consumer behaviors. So next slide, please. So we are here today to talk about the topic why brands matter. And there are two key reasons why brands matter. Obviously, on one hand, brands bring emotional value to consumers. The most iconic category-leading brands, they occupy an emotional space in consumer minds. Tiffany doesn't stand for jewelry or diamond jewelry, they stand for love. Coca-Cola doesn't stand for refreshment, they stand for happiness. Dolce & Gabbana, they are not just another fashion brand, they're in the business of living the Italian lifestyle. La Durée is all about pleasure. Apple, they are not in the business of electronics or computers, they're in the business of creativity, unleashing creativity. And finally, Patagonia, they're in the business of saving the planet. So carving this emotional space is a real challenge and really a craftsmanship. But if you manage as a brand to create this intangible emotional value, you have a chance to occupy, to really be a category leader, and you are able to contribute significant value to the business. So which leads me to my next point. So in addition to delivering emotional value to consumers, brands can add significant tangible value for companies and economies. Based on the data from 2019, in the US alone, brands have contributed over 3.1 trillion to economy. So the US, as you can see from a global perspective, has benefited from brands the most. China is in the second position. On the left-hand side, you have different sectors, but if managed properly, brands can contribute a significant value to economies and to companies. And why is it important right now? Especially because of the pandemic. Brands actually can play a significant strategic role in helping to improving economies and helping to add value to both governments as well as societies. Next slide, please. So based on the Brands Finance report, these are the top 10 most valuable global brands in the world. And 8 out of 10 are actually technology brands. And as you can see, most of them come from the US. So what does it take to build a high value brand? Doesn't matter if the brand is local or global. The next slide, please. And as you can see, in addition to being the most valuable global brands, you can look at brands from a regional point of view as well, and you can see the significant value they can bring to a region or a country or an economy. Next slide, please. So we have partnered with Profit, and there is a point of view about what does it take today, what is the formula to build a high value, the highest value brands, and we call it something living brand ecosystem. We used to talk about brand idea, brand experiences, and now this living brand ecosystem, it seems to be a formula to craft a high value brand. And what all of those brands have in common, they create relentless relevance. And not surprisingly, you saw the 8 out of 10 most valuable brands came from the technology sector. So this is why you can see how they're doing this to stay constantly relevant. They're leveraging technology and intelligence to be constantly relevant, to create constantly irrational loyalty. So let's just look at some of the components. What does it take to create a living brand ecosystem? First of all, we have to ask ourselves the question, what's going on right now? And especially in the last 2 years, but this has been going on obviously for way longer. Technology has moved and has evolved significantly. and the technology revolution is happening faster than ever. It's become more relevant, more intelligent, and more powerful. And as the result of this, next slide, please, consumers are becoming more empowered ever than before. They're always on, always connected, and they're expecting brands to really adapt to their own behaviors on their own terms. So being highly personalized, coming up with highly personalized solutions is something that consumers demand, because now they can, because of technology. So let's go to the next slide. So these are the 4 ingredients that we believe the living brands have in common. Number 1, they are purpose-driven systems. So all of them have purpose as the beating heart of the business behavior. This is not just a communication strategy, but they have purpose embedded in the business strategy and the business behavior. What do? They build hyper-personalized experiences. How do they work? By leveraging human empathy and tech-enabled intelligence. And how are they different? They replace consistency with flexible strategies that are continuously tested and optimized. So as you can see, because of technology, because of a constant gathering of data and constantly analyzing the data, these brands are able to replace consistency with always on communication strategies, content strategies, data analytics, etc., etc. Let's move to the next step. So there are some just of the examples of brands that have disrupted categories, because very often those living ecosystem brands, they are the category leaders. They come in and they have the power very often to disrupt a category. And they do this by coming up with by elevating themselves above the category and coming up with new vocabulary that never existed in the category. And this allows them to disrupt the space. But all of them, as you can see, maybe with an exception of Starbucks, but they're technology enabled. But what all of them have in common is that they had the bravery to occupy a space that lives above the category. Next slide, please. So I go just quickly one by one ingredients. The first one is living brands embed the purpose as the beating heart. So you can see as example of Ladurée, for example, the idea of pleasure has been consistently translated from product development to the website, to the store design, to everything the brand does. Next slide, please. The living brand ecosystem, the highest value brands that hyper-personalized. So they use a lot of craftsmanship and thinking and technology to figure out how to come up with hyper-personalized solutions. In the case of Nespresso, there were the 16 Grand Crus. In the case of Disney, it was the Magic Band that enables personalized experience for the visitors. Next slide, please. The next ingredient is those living brand ecosystems that are contextuals. They are able to evolve with the consumer depending on the environment. And Nike is a great example here. Nike enables runners to represent and captain their neighborhoods when they train via the Nike Plus app. Nike's activities and look and feel become neighborhood specific, driving not only usage, but also deep engagement with consumers. So again, using technology, using data to move with the consumers being constantly relevant, as I said. Next slide, please. The highest value brands are very intelligent. They're using data to basically come up with custom solutions, and then Netflix and Starbucks are great examples for that. Next slide, please. And finally, they're continuously with the consumer. The Alexa voice agent makes it fun and natural for people to strike up a conversation. Marriott is using a WeChat to be constantly in touch with their consumers, and Apple has the 24/7 customer service. So being relentlessly, constantly in touch with consumer this is another ingredient of what these brands do. Next slide, please. So as you can see, the branding kind of paradigm has evolved significantly from prescribed marketing back then to something that we call living marketing, to create this living brand ecosystem. So in order to get there, you really need a completely different operating model, the marketing suite, to be able to deliver on this living marketing proposition where we are constantly optimizing and are constantly listening to come up with solutions that are moving together with the consumers. Next slide, please. Yes, and IBM is a very good example of a brand that has kind of evolved from the prescribed to the living ecosystem. And obviously with the introduction of Watson was really kind of the breakthrough that allowed them to enter this living ecosystem space. Next slide, please. So in summary, in this context, brands and experiences are evaluated against very different set of criteria. When you are, if you have the ambition to be a category leader, you have to ask yourself those questions. Are you purpose-driven? Are you hyper-personalized? Are you contextual? Are you intelligent? Are you continuous? These are some of the new questions we think CMOs have to ask themselves in order to really manage and be able to own high-value brands locally or globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dagmara. And now I believe we're ready to hand over to Rahul, who will be delivering his presentation. Thanks, Rahul.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. If we can go to my first slide. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the most ubiquitous, recognizable energy brand in the world, what you call Shell. You know, it started in the early 20th century, and over the last 120 plus years, it's become an iconic symbol of reassurance on the quality of our products and services to all our customers and stakeholders. So the story that I'm about to tell you in the context of global and local is how did we become this big ubiquitous brand? And the thesis that I will put towards everyone today is that essentially it's been built locally, but with help from a lot of global efficiencies. If you can go to the next slide, please. Just to give you a little bit of idea on the scale of this brand, every single day, 450 kilometers of roads are paved with Shell bitumen. Every 2 minutes, we serve a customer 24 hours a day at 46,000 sites worldwide. We fuel a plane every 14 seconds with Shell Aviation Fuel, and we communicate with about 50,000 pieces of communication through our various markets on any given year. So that's my team having to approve about 200 to 240 new pieces of communication every single working day. So that's the scale of this brand. So how did we get here in 177 countries over 100 years? If you can go to the next slide. This is just a reinforcement of the previous data as well. According to Brand Finance, we are the most valuable brand in the industry. We've increased the value of this brand by about 50% in the last 5 years alone. We're ranked AAA in the brand rating. And if you could go to the next slide. And so the point I'm trying to make is that this brand has been built because the customers in each of these 177 countries have experienced the Shell brand locally through the efforts of local marketing. And these local marketing efforts have been amplified by the work of global. And I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. Now, powerful brands are built by a combination of things, right? So in the case of Shell, it's the responsiveness to local needs, the competitive context, the products that we offered in each of the markets, the channels we chose and how we worked with our channel partners, such as distributors or retailers, the pricing strategies, the communication plans, all of this is local. So in that context, brands are ultimately local. Now, where the global part really kicks in is a couple of areas. You can have a cohesive global brand promise and a set of equities that you would like to maintain. That drives a lot of efficiencies in terms of whether it's packaging or whether it's innovation product innovation, commercial innovation, reapplication across markets, learning from one market and sharing with the other before the local competitors find out new models and new marketing techniques, as well as serious cost efficiency in campaign development and packaging, as I said, and many other things. And increasingly, as some brands, not necessarily Shell yet, but as some brands are perceived to be superior if they are global versus local in some contexts, then that helps the global brands as well. And the perception that you are a multi-market brand helps accelerate that local brand building. So powerful brands need a mix of local and global, ideally, in order to really beat competition. If you can go to the next slide. So here is some print advertising, a bit global, a bit local. So if you start from the right, you see we've localized our lubricant oil for motorcycles for Pakistan, right? And if you see the middle, it's a local Thai celebrity. In the bottom middle, it's the Vietnamese context. But on the left side is a global campaign where the concept of endorsement by Ducati was something that worked across markets. So from a point of view of how do you adapt communication in this case as one of the many marketing tools that you have across global and local, it's absolutely possible without losing your identity, so to speak. If you can go to the next slide. We have another brand called V-Power, which is our premium fuel. And what you see is a range of offers, but essentially the messaging across these local campaigns is cohesive, as you can see. And I'll show you a bit of a piece of advertising next from Australia to give you a feel of how that global ethos is translated country by country. If you can please show the advertising. And then if you can go to the next slide, please. I'd like to show you this film and then end with a single slide. This was a local campaign which we developed for India. It's won a couple of awards. And it shows you how a global brand can be made to come alive with very, very hyper-local insights. If you can please show that ad. It's got subtitles for English.
आप ये ट्रक
क्यों? लड़कियां ट्रक नहीं चला सकती?
नहीं, पहली बार देख रहा हूँ ना, इसके लिए पूछा।
प्लान तो लॉ प्रैक्टिस करने का था और बदलना पड़ा। वो हस्बैंड।
I'm sorry।
चैलेंज था, उठा लिया मैंने। अब या तो पास्ट को पकड़ के बैठे रहो या फ्यूचर देखो। कॉलेज में हैं दोनों।
गुड लक।
लक वो तो खुद बनानी पड़ती है।
great things happen when we move, and the insight around mobility, which was quite relevant for India. At the end of the day, I guess my last slide and my last point is, when you want to win and you want to build your brand, ultimately a couple of those principles don't change. How deeply do you understand your customer, where you position yourself versus competition, versus their sort of a list of brands that they're considering locally. What's your pricing? What's your channel strategy? Are you available when they need you? What's your innovation pipeline to stay ahead? And how are you communicating with your customers? To the previous speakers, Dagmara's point around the living ecosystem, how are you engaging and building that connection with them? All of that is enabled by global, but executed locally. So I'd like to sort of argue that there is very little around what is a global brand or a local brand. All brands are built locally. I'd like to hand over to Mehul Kapadia now.
Awesome. Thank you, Rahul. Thank you, Rahul. And thank you to Brand Finance and TCS for having me on this session today. Congratulations, David and team, for your 25th anniversary, and may you have many more. It's such a fascinating topic, and so inspired by seeing what Dagmara shared about a whole range of global insights on how brands are built. And to Rahul's point around, how are brands really getting built both at the global and local level, right? Very interesting insights there. I'll try and build on this, and there were three areas that I wanted to explore, essentially as a conversation with you. There are no slides, so you'll have to listen to me on this one. The first was that as marketeers, as we are looking at brands now, and there is the global and local lens, how do we also add into the mix the neighborhood brands, and also this whole thing about the personal brand, right? So that's one area that I wanted to explore, which is the global versus local versus neighborhood versus personal brand. The second is exactly to the point that Rahul said, which is about global and local. And I would like to actually build on that case further by saying this global is local, right? And vice versa, where local is global. And the third area that I wanted to touch upon is the brand relevancy by segment, right? So I represent Vodafone Business. I head up marketing for the MNC and corporate segment there. And before that, I used to be with Tata Communications. So I've been in the technology B2B space for a long time. And how do we build brand relevancy in that technology B2B side was really the third area that I wanted to touch upon as we do our conversation today. So getting on to the first one, if I were to say the name unbox therapy, right? Unbox therapy, what would that mean to you? What would come to your mind? And in the parlance of brand, if you think of it, this is actually the brand of a YouTuber, Jack. He does the filming. They have 18.1 million subscribers on YouTube alone, and they've delivered about 4.1 billion views on YouTube. Now, compare that to Nike, and Nike, of course, does advertising in a whole range of things, right? Not just YouTube. But if you look at Nike on YouTube, they have about 1.6 million compared to the 18 million that Unbox Therapy has. And Nike's had about 500 million views on YouTube compared to the 4 billion of Unbox Therapy. And Unbox Therapy as a brand, essentially it's this YouTuber just sits and unboxes technology. He'll just bring it alive in front of you. So if a new iPhone comes or a new vacuum cleaner comes up or a whole range of technology things, and it's remarkable how an individual has been able to build that kind of a personal brand, especially on the back of this digital, which is available to all of us now. And hence, when we think about brands now in the context of global, local, and big organizations like Shell and Vodafone and things like that, how do we reflect upon how brand building is happening in so many different ways and in areas of creating personal brands, right? And touching on neighborhood, right? I think one of the things that COVID did is essentially really brought the local neighborhood into action again as things started opening up. And a lot of us consciously trying to shop locally to support the local business, ensure the high street is active and thriving. And that has brought into its own a lot of neighborhood brands as well, right? And I think why are these two important to refer to is because as we are building our global brands, as we are building our global brands in local markets as well, the way we can interact and the way we thrive in this ecosystem of neighborhood brands, of brands which are these personal YouTubers, etc., does bring into question how the whole mix will evolve. So that was one of the areas that I thought we should explore and dialogue on. The second is a brilliant example that Rahul gave about Shell on global is local, right? And in fact, I had a story to share on Cadbury. Some of you would have seen it, some of you may not have. But if you look at Cadbury's as a brand, and you could argue it's a proper global brand, it is, right? I mean, across so many markets, originating from UK. But if you experience it in India, and that's where I grew up in my childhood, and you would have never felt that that's a quote unquote foreign brand, right? The brand related and came across in the way that it was truly local as far as we were concerned. I think some of the executions that they did on cricket, and it's great to see that I think pretty much 20 years on, they've now done one more similar execution, and they've switched it over from a male lead character to a female lead character and gone into that. It just shows how that if you're able to build the right brand connect, map to the local audiences, and bring in the right elements. Like in India, you bring in a certain elements of drama and Bollywoodness to the whole thing, and it does elevate your entire brand loyalty and affinity. So I think we can really build that case that global is local and vice versa. And we saw some great example of that video there on Shell as well. The third area that I wanted to touch upon is this whole thing about brand relevancy by segment, right? David and I, as we were preparing for this, one of the points that we were discussing on is that why did a bunch of brands become global in the past, right? And in some sense, it was possibly the economic necessity of the brand to grow. So how did you expand? You took the same product and offering that you had in one market and took it to another market, right? Or either you acquired something in that market and rebranded it to yours, so you started getting global scale. So the economic necessity of the brand led to that kind of expansion, right? But if you now start seeing, depending on the segment you are in, sometimes you just may not be able to actually build a local brand. You may have to depend on global alone, right? I mean, take the example of cybersecurity. If you're going to use cybersecurity, especially when it touches the internet, right? Are you going to trust a brand which is just operating in one geography? In some cases you will, if it's a large enough geography. Or would you actually trust somebody who's trusted in multiple locations? Especially because cybersecurity as a service, the name implies, touches the internet, and hence you actually want somebody who can be operating in multiple geographies. So how do you now start building that dimension of why can brands scale or not scale, depending upon the relevancy of the offering that they have, the relevancy of hence into the space that they operate in, right? And the final point to close on from that relevancy standpoint is also now whether you're already operating in markets which are so large that you may actually not need to or want to expand, right? So if you see some of the mobile brands, one of the mobile brands in India right now, they've actually chosen just to be in India because the market is so large enough for them that they would rather conquer that rather than expand into other geographies. Or if you look at cloud services, while in Europe and Americas, we'll talk a lot about Google and Azure and AWS, But Asia Pac, Alibaba is big. Alibaba is actually way bigger out there compared to the other markets. So sometimes it's also, again, determined by, do you trust your data to be in the cloud? Which brands will you trust your data to be in, etc., that are starting to determine whether you can be global or local or either of the two. So those were really the three areas that I wanted to touch upon, and hope a lot of this sparks into a conversation for all of us. So thank you. And over to David.
Thank you, Mehul. And thank you to Rahul and Dagmara as well. So I think we now have 20 minutes to have a lively debate about some of those points. I think what I'd like to do is, and I haven't pre-warned you three about this, but one of the things that I was thinking about as I was preparing for the discussion was that over the last 25 years, the presumption that brands are a good thing has somewhat been eroded. You know, there are quite a lot of commentators who say brands are actually a conspiracy of capitalism to screw the underdogs, take their money away, and make a lot of money for fat cats. You know, Naomi Klein with her no logo, you know, Freedom in the City and Extinction Rebellion and any number of different other pressure groups are actually saying brands are a bad thing. And, you know, this is one of the things that we worked on with Dagmara in producing this report about why brands matter. So our presumption is brands are a good thing. I mean, how seriously do you think that the world is now beginning to think that brands are just some big conspiracy? So let's start with Rahul, because you probably get more of these accusations than most.
Honestly, a brand, as we all know, is essentially started from the cattle business, right? It was just a mark. It was a mark of quality that this cattle has been well fed, and this cattle is owned by somebody, and so on and so forth. So a brand is just a mark of quality. So I would argue that Naomi Klein, no brand is a brand, because it is saying something. It has certain emotional attributes around what it stands for, right? So I would argue brands have and will always be valid. That being said, the conventional delivery of the brands of very low-level messages like, here's my product, here's my price, go buy it, is what people are not comfortable with. Because if you look at large sort of PR trust trackers, you will see that the expectation on the corporation has changed over the last few decades. And people expect brands and the corporations that own them to do more for them and for society than just sell that product. So I think that's what is really behind the supposed attack on the brand, which is essentially just a front for the corporation behind it.
But do you think that cynicism about global brands creates an advantage for local brands or smaller brands? It seems to me that there was a presumption 25 that they were a good thing because they were, you know, big brands could reduce costs, therefore that would be good for consumers. You have consistent quality around the world and all this sort of thing. And nowadays, that argument it seems to be disregarded. You know, it's very much the local has got to be better kind of thing. But I mean, what do you think, Mehul?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, this whole concept of shop small, which is happening so much these days to try and attract, and that's from a retail context, attract people into local audiences. I think what's probably important is for brands now to really have a purpose beyond what they had as an identity, right? Because as Raul said, probably brand evolved to give an identity, give a real kind of stamp of quality or an expectation of service, right? So you know that if you have this is a service and this is your expectation that will be there. I think the time is now really to be more purpose driven, because a lot of the issues which are being spoken about are real, right? Because if you just had a big global corporation taking away a lot of the profits into a different geography and not investing where the consumption is happening, then it will lead to that kind of a little bit of a backlash, right? So I do feel, going back to that point of the economic reality of the brand, I think it is really important for brands now to service the markets from where they make their revenues, right? and have a purpose which is linked into that geography. And that's how it really creates and resonates with that audience.
So Dagmara, do you have a thought on this, my challenge?
Yes, I think as Raul mentioned, the expectations from brands has increased significantly, and it doesn't matter if you're a local brand or a global brand, the expectations are the same. You either serve the local community or you serve the global community. And I think unfortunately because of unfortunately because of technology, in a digital age, every brand is on the stage and everybody comments and evaluates. In the past, it was just the financial community evaluating the brands and maybe the trade, and now all the consumers are also evaluating and commenting. So if you're a global brand, you have a way harder, it's a way more challenging to really service this local community, the global community, in ways that are relevant locally. You have to, the rules have evolved. You have to be really skilled in mining the local insights real time and also connecting yourself to what's happening in a given country to stay relevant and to add value. And we talk about brand purpose. What we've seen in the last 10 years, brand purpose and was just a marketing tool in a lot of cases. But what consumers are demanding today is really for the purpose to be embedded in the brand's business strategy. So the brands have to walk the talk. They can't just talk about it, they have to walk it. So the rules have changed. It's becoming more difficult to truly manage global brands, to stay relevant and admired and loved. However, some of those iconic brands still manage to do this. So I think CMOs are catching up with what it takes to manage a global brand versus a local brand. But I think it's easier on a local level because you have a way smaller community.
My next step on from that first question is they're not a capitalist conspiracy against the world, but are they a sort of a new form of colonialism? Like there seems to be a presumption that global brands are a good idea, but only when they come from America or Europe. And in the last 10 years or so, a number of countries have actually started to create their own global brands, and it's quite interesting how they're generally resented. So I remember when Tata first came to the UK and bought Chorus, and also bought Jaguar Land Rover, and also bought Twinings and various other things. There was a lot of sort of humping about the fact that how could an Indian company come over here and run all these brands? And I remember that Peter Mandelson, who was the trade secretary at the time, was asked for governmental support for I think it was the steel industry, the steel part, and they were turned down. And it was so obviously antagonism to some upstart Indian company coming over to Britain and taking over this big company, totally irrelevant, wrong. And nowadays we have Chinese companies that are trying to go global. So, this question about colonialism and whether or not global brands invented elsewhere can go anywhere they want to. I mean, do you think that really exists, or am I just making it up? Who shall I ask to answer that one? Back to you, Rahul.
Honestly, I don't think the national origin of brands, unless it's a key part of the category code, is that important. People who buy Zara have no idea where it comes from. Half the people who buy Samsung may think it's from a different country than it's originally from. And the story of Haagen-Dazs, which is very much American, but they've made the name sound very European. My point of view is that the national origin only matters when the category has that level of sensitivity, and there are not that many categories that are in that area. So if you are able to prove that you care for them, to the community point from Dagmara, if you're able to prove that you're authentic and you're consistent and you're good quality and you're meeting their selfish human needs, which are the base of the Maslow hierarchy, then the rest of the needs can then be met or talked about and so on. So that's my personal point of view.
So Dagmara, what do you think?
I fully agree. if you are able as a brand creator to identify a purpose and a set of values that resonate globally, and you execute it in a way that really adds value, I think it really doesn't matter where you come from. And a lot of, and especially with Generation Z, they really don't buy brands, they buy into brands. They buy into the values and beliefs. So I really think this is the key today. But I think, as Raul mentioned, you know, there are a lot of brands around the world that people are clueless where they come from. But of course, when you look at the whole landscape as an investor, I mean, it's clear that you know, in the past, the US has dominated the global brand landscape, and this global landscape is becoming more competitive, and China is definitely getting more aggressive in terms of owning more global brands, and so is Europe. You know, I wish there were more brands coming from Latin America or Africa, but they will come eventually. So it all depends. I think from the consumer perspective, it doesn't matter. I think, you know, when it comes to technology, obviously Shenzhen versus Silicon Valley, there is some rivalry there. So to your point, there is some sort of a global ambition to dominate that sector. But yeah, it depends who is discussing the topic, I think.
I think one of the interesting things is that, well, certainly what we have noticed is that there are quite a lot of companies coming from places like India, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, who come over to Britain, come over to Europe, come over to America, and rather than necessarily create a brand and bring it in with them, I don't know, like Huawei or, you know, lots of other similar local companies over there, they are putting a lot more effort into acquiring brands in the local markets, and then they actually keep their own identity quite discreet and build up the old brand. And by a weird irony, many of the brands that were eliminated in this rush towards monolithic brands, monolithic global brands, very often were good quality local brands that have been allowed to lapse. And now people like China and India are coming back over and going, well, so what's wrong with MG? Why don't we relaunch it? What's wrong with Triumph motorcycles? You know, they've got 50 or 100 years of providing good local solutions. Let's buy it and revive it. And so it's kind of, the worm has turned. You know, the people from abroad are coming in and buying up these brands and regenerating the local brands. I mean, do you think that's true, Mehul? I mean, could that happen in the telecom market with some of the brands you got rid of?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And actually, this goes back to the core point that if the brand stands for something where the customer values, right, then the ownership of that really does not matter as long as that value can be extracted for the customer, right? So you mentioned the Tata acquisition of Jaguar Land Rover, and it's a fantastic case study in some sense if you look at it, that although Tata acquired it, Tata Motors probably was making more trucks and passenger cars for a very different audience in India. The richness and the premiumness of Jaguar Land Rover was continued to be retained. In fact, it only got built on it further in the way JLR got established further in different markets. So I think it's about ensuring that you're giving the brand, you're treating it like that living organism that, you know, we were referring to, Dagmara was also touching on it at the start, and letting it breathe in its real space. And as long as that is done, customers accept it, right? And they actually want it, right? There is another case study, right, of India, of Thumbs Up. So India has a very popular cola brand called Thumbs Up, right? And actually growing up, that would be the cola that I would like to drink, not even Coca-Cola or Pepsi, right? Coca-Cola came into the market. When the second time around they came into the market, and they almost tried to, in some sense, establish Coca-Cola at the expense of Thumbs Up. But if you see customer preferences, Thumbs Up is still live and active, right? In fact, I cherish buying that in London. I can get that here as well. So sometimes it's that importance of the need of that brand for the consumer that should be sustained rather than the ownership part of it.
Before we move on, I've got another question which I'll end with. But before I move on, I just wanted to comment on the ad you showed, Rahul, with that Indian lady who was the lawyer. which it just shows the power of advertising, doesn't it? That was an incredibly tear-jerking story, and tremendous, I imagine, in emotional terms for getting loyalty. But one of the things that did go through my mind was the message and the whole narrative of it is the sort of thing that would appeal anywhere around the world. You know, I'm sure English people or American people seeing that will get a tear in their eye and a lump in their throat. And I was just interested to know, does it actually work in India? Because it's quite a male chauvinist place generally, isn't it?
It does work. It has worked for us quite a bit, that whole campaign. It's around 3 different women. One was a stunt woman, one was the first truck driver, and the other one was a lady who started travels for single women who felt unsafe traveling alone, and they were expected to only travel with their husband on holiday and so on. And so these groups of single women started binding, going together. And all 3 are emotional stories around the power of mobility and the ability to, move on from your current circumstances. So mobility meant in 2 different ways. It definitely worked. As for the male chauvinism, having lived in 7 countries, it's everywhere, unfortunately.
Oh well, maybe it won't be in the future. So I'm just going to end with quoting from Professor Ted Levitt, who thought up the idea of all these global brands, 30 years ago or whenever it was. And he said, as new media and technology shrink the world, people's tastes will converge, creating a single global market that will be dominated by the world's most successful brands. Which is quite interesting, really, because it's almost tangentially wrong, isn't it? As technology has proliferated, it's actually allowed greater fragmentation of brands and greater fragmentation of delivery, which sort of suggests that global brands are doomed. Do you think that apart from maybe in infrastructure areas, and maybe Shell and Vodafone are 2 of those infrastructure areas, but do you think as a whole, we are moving towards more fragmentation and more locality? And should brand managers be getting used to the idea they're going to have a much more diverse portfolio of brands rather than try and shrink them all down, as has been the case for the last 20 years? So that's my last question. Over to you. Dagmara, why don't you just start?
I think it's a combination of both, really. I think global brands are here to stay and grow. And I see more global brands simply because of technology. Technology has enabled like-minded consumers to get together and get closer together. So, teenagers in Africa have way more in common with teenagers in on other continents than they have with their own parents. And now, because of technology, they can connect with brands like Adidas and Nike and Samsung. And at the same time, I think there is a huge movement towards localization and authenticity and local communities. So I can see a lot of local brands being born, and some of them will become global because they will probably develop purpose and a set of values that will resonate. But I think it was absolutely right. Global brands are able to connect like-minded consumers. And you saw this beautiful Shell ad. We call it in advertising the universal truth. Those truths can be truly universal globally. And this is what those iconic global brands are able to uncover. They tap into a universal global truth, and they come, and basically this executions of based on that can travel around the world with some local tweaks. But this is the power of global brands. They stand for something bigger. It's not just the product, a commodity, but an emotion, and they're able to connect with consumers on a highly different level.
So Rahul, what do you think about that? Are global brands going to have more of a run for their money against the local ones in future, and there'll be a lot more fragmentation?
I think
Go ahead.
I think the definitions will be less easy to differentiate between what's global and what's local, because the nature of marketing has shifted. You're able to target locally, hyper local, personalized. You can go within a city to a part of the city these days, and so on. So, you know, what is local and what is global is changing, and, you know, and you're able to actually think very differently about how brands are built. That being said, I don't see a huge proliferation in the portfolio of brands today with your question, because brand building takes time, it takes effort, it takes cost. So it's far more efficient from a CMO's P&L to use that same money to build a trademark, a name. Essentially, a brand is a name of quality, right? And that is then executed in such hyper-local ways that nobody ever knows, you know, what it is. And to the previous question's point, it doesn't matter which country it comes from. Nokia, people in rural India used it, right? A couple of decades ago, or a decade or two ago. No, I had no idea where Finland was.
And Mehul, if you want to have the last word, and then I'll just wrap up.
Yeah. See, I think today is the age of micro-segmentation, right? And micro-segmentation across everything that we do. And hence, brands which can be versatile to appeal to those micro-segments in the way and form that they want them to. They can be local, global, they can thrive, right? And if you don't appeal to those segments, they'll have choice. So I think that's really where I would say brands will need to be. Can you be versatile enough to appeal to that range of micro-segments that exist out there?
Great. Well, that's been a very interesting discussion backwards and forwards. And I'll just end with one final thought, which is that I went to a presentation about 5 years ago where the CEO of SAB Miller was talking about global versus local brands. And because they have brands like Miller and you know, a number of other major brands, the presumption, I think, well, from the organizer was that the CEO would actually be singing the praises of global brands. But he basically said, well, in the beer industry, there are one or two brands, but very few brands that you could actually accuse of being global, one of which is Heineken. But he did say, well, actually, Heineken's only really big in about 10 markets, even though you can buy bottles of it everywhere. It's not really global in the sense that it's everywhere. He said the issue with the beer industry is that everyone's tastes are different in every market and even in sub-markets. And so they have hundreds of beer brands meeting all these different tastes. And so I think personally, it does depend whether or not you're talking about a thing on personal consumption. I remember years ago, we did a project for a carbonated drinks company in Singapore called Yones, and they sell flat drinks made with bean curd and all sorts of different things that nobody in the West would ever drink. We did a project for Godrej in India where they were talking about hair products, and something I'd never even thought of was that, well, actually, Indian hair is completely different from European hair. And one of their scientists was telling me, oh, yeah, it's completely different. And then the hair they have in Africa is different again. So I think when it comes to consumer products, there will be fragmentation, and global brands have a struggle on their hands. Where you have brands that there is a logic for some infrastructure globally, whether it's oil, telecoms, technology, global brands probably will continue to thrive. But I do think that they will be under a lot more pressure from local brands for all the reasons we've been talking about. So I think we're in for a very interesting ride. And let's hope that the investment community and the finance community has a slightly more subtle view about it than they have over the last 25 years, where I think it's fair to say the financial community has always said, oh, don't faff around with all those brands, just have one, get rid of all the rest. And I don't think we're going to see that in the next generation. So thanks for the conversation. It's been a very interesting, stimulating debate, and I look forward to the next one. I hope you'll all join us, and that everyone listening will come and join us on the next two. I'll hand to you, Zoe, to close down and say when those two events are going to be.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you to all our speakers for the very insightful presentations and extremely interesting discussion this afternoon. Just to let you know, all our webinars are available to view on the Brand Finance YouTube channel, and this webinar recorded will be circulated to all our delegates tomorrow afternoon. Thank you to all our participants for joining us today as well. And I'd like to, again, as David mentioned, take the opportunity to invite you to our next Global Forum webinar in the series, which is on the 28th of October brand purpose, and then following that, the webinar, the 25th of October, the rise of Asian brands. Both of the joining links have been posted in the webinar chat. If you'd like any further information on the topic discussed today or how to register for upcoming webinars, please email me at events@brandfinance.com. And thank you all once again for joining us today, and look forward to reconnecting with you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.